All right, Larry, we'll just wait, maybe, I know we're right at 9:30. Let's give it another minute, 30 seconds or so, just to let folks trickle in, and then we'll get started.
It looks like the number of attendees other than panelists is up to 26. Oh.
Senator Smith, is that a real background or a fake background behind you?
This is a real, I'm at the Williamsburg Inn, and
Oh,
it's
wow, how
a
pretty.
real background. Little office nook that they've got here.
All right, Larry, let's roll.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, Larry, you're mute. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Larry Hirschmann, the Temple Emmanuel Brotherhood President. And on behalf of the Temple, welcome to everyone. This past week, like all too many, we had gun violence, including mass shootings occurring across the nation as well as locally. Temple Emmanuel is dedicated this weekend to confronting this plague. And tonight, Friday night Shabbat service, we were honored and moved by activist and resident Fred Guttenberg, who shared his personal story of loss and his hope for the future regarding gun violence. In addition to this morning's panel program, later today, Fred will meet with our 11th and 12th graders and our older Kestie youth. Fred will also be on our panel this morning, and more about him and our other panelists in just a few moments. I also want to thank our guest panelists and everyone who made this weekend possible, starting with Rabbi Aaron Rosenwasser, Executive Director Diane Nyman, Director of Congregational Learning, Rabbi Mark Levine, and Director of Youth Engagement Services, Rebecca Gerbitz. In addition, much thanks and appreciation to our Temple co-sponsors, WRJ, CSAC, and the Brotherhood. And finally, I'm most grateful to today's moderator, Andrew Stavisky, who superbly handled most of the planning and preparation for this program. So thank you so much for attending, and now I'll turn it over to Andrew. Thanks, Andrew.
Larry, thank you so much for that introduction. I want to echo Larry's thanks to everyone who made this event and the weekend possible. Working with everyone putting this event together has been great. I want to welcome and thank so much our panel for joining us this morning to talk about this extremely important subject. And I want to also thank those in the audience that have got up early on a Sunday to listen into this morning. We're really excited about this conversation that we're going to have today, and you know, for the next hour and a half, depending on how it goes, hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes, we'll we hope to cover a lot of topics and have a really lively discussion. We're in a Zoom webinar format this morning, so the only people with their cameras and mics are the panelists and myself and Larry, and the Diane name that you see is Diane Nyman, who's our executive director at Temple Emmanuel. She's not actually with us, but she's the host of this technology-wise, so that's where you see her name. And as Larry mentioned, my name's Andrew Stavisky. I'm on the Temple Emmanuel Board of Trustees and the Brotherhood Board. And I'm just thrilled to have the honor of serving as the moderator for today's panel. I want to just say first how incredible it's been to watch how in the last few years, Fred Guttenberg's turned the tragedy of his daughter Jamie's death into a life mission of activism against gun violence, where he's truly helping to shape the national agenda on these issues. He's inspired many to follow his lead. As Larry alluded to a few minutes ago, Fred's participation today is part of a larger involvement with Temple Emmanuel as what we're calling our activist in residence for the weekend. Although it's a virtual residence, right? Because we're all virtual now because of COVID. Fred spoke on Friday night about some of the lessons from his book, Find the Helpers, with Rabbi Adam at our Shabbat service. And later today, he's going to meet with our older teens to talk about some of these issues as well. Also his book, talk about his book, answer questions. So for the teens that have joined this morning and are going to be with him later, that should also be a great event. And I just want to remind you that in the registration link that you got into to register for the event this morning, there's a link for Fred's book, Find the Helpers. There's an additional link for Fred's charity, Orange Ribbons for Jamie, which raises money for gun violence prevention events and scholarships for those involved in some of Jamie's interests, including dance, including physical therapy. And as you may know, we're compiling donations this weekend for Orange Ribbons for Jamie. And a few of the Temple groups that Larry mentioned are also matching some of the donations as well. So please feel free to get back in on that link if you haven't already and make a donation. And as I alluded to, we'd initially planned to have this event in person. COVID restrictions have moved us online. As it turns out, some of our panelists are out of town today. And so it's worked out for the best that we're doing this virtually. And we're really glad that everyone's here, both our panelists and those who have joined to watch. And we, as you can see, have 5 distinguished panelists here today. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we'll get into our discussion, which is what we're all here for. The way this will work is we'll have a few specific topics that I'm going to bring up. And I have a few specific questions for each panelist along the way, but I'll also open the issue up to everyone on the panel. And for those watching that may have questions, we're going to do a Q&A session at the end. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, if you could put those questions as you get them in the Q&A box and not the chat, because the Q&A box is what we'll be able to get those questions from. So make sure you do that, and then we'll get to those later on. Later on this morning. So without any further ado, I'm going to do real quick introductions of everyone, some of whom you may know, some of whom you may not know. I will do this in alphabetical order, and then we're going to jump into our conversation so we can get the panelists talking and not me. But first, we have Liz Bannock. Hi, Liz. Liz grew up in rural Virginia. Her father was a hunter, so she grew up around guns. She's the executive director of the nonprofit association, Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, which has its mission to reduce gun violence in Maryland through evidence-based solutions. Liz is proud to be at the helm of an organization that focuses its attention and resources on those individuals that are disproportionately affected by gun violence, people who use guns to commit suicide, young men and women of color living in urban areas. So we're thrilled that Liz is with us today. And so thanks again for joining. Fred Guttenberg. Fred is an activist who many of you know or have seen for gun violence prevention issues. He began his public life after the murder of his beautiful 14-year-old Jamie in the Parkland school shooting, February 14th, 2018. And a few months prior to the murder of Jamie, Fred's brother Michael passed away in October 2017 from cancer related to his service in 9/11 as a first responder, being one of the original first responders at the World Trade Center with a team of doctors who were initially trapped at the World Trade Center as it collapsed. They luckily survived, and Michael was able to treat folks on site for a few weeks before the particles that he inhaled caused a cancer that he succumbed to a couple years ago. Following his involvement in these 2 distinctly American tragedies, Fred's traveled the country talking about both of those events, but also talking really about perspective, perseverance, and resilience. He discusses pivotal moments in our lives and how we respond to those moments. He talked a lot about that on Friday night. with the moving, what I call the fireside chat with Rabbi Adam on Friday. And Fred and his wife now spend their time challenging our elected officials to do more. They, as I mentioned, began a nonprofit organization dedicated to Jamie's life called Orange Ribbons for Jamie. He's been a regular on news, TV programs, and myriad of online and print media. And through the formation of his nonprofit, this is now a full-time mission for him. So thanks again so much, Fred, for joining us. Next, we have Hannah Rubin, and Hannah's a current junior at Walter Johnson High School, which is down the road a bit in North Bethesda, Maryland. She's also a member of our Temple Religious School. She was part of the Temple confirmation class last year. She has volunteered for March for Our Lives, helping to mobilize thousands of people across the country and register them to vote. She's lobbied on Capitol Hill numerous times in support of various gun violence prevention legislation. We're really happy to have Hannah with us, providing the youth perspective on these gun violence prevention issues. And so hoping that Hannah gets to give her thoughts a lot this morning. Thanks also to Maryland State Senator Will Smith for joining us from his weekend in Virginia. Senator Smith's been a member of the Maryland State Senate since 2016, where he became the first African-American member of the state Senate from Montgomery County. He represents the 20th district in Maryland, which for those of you who don't know where that is, it covers Tacoma Park and Silver Spring. And I guess it sort of runs northeast from the DC line, like up Colesville Road to a bit south of the ICC. So there's a lot of districts, and that's the one that he is representative for. He's chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which is the committee that has oversight on the gun violence prevention related issues. So we're thrilled to have him here today as well. He's a local boy, born and raised in Silver Spring, and got his bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary, as well as I believe his JD, where in between he was at Hopkins for an MA in government. So welcome to Senator Smith. And then finally, and then we can get started, Daniel Webster, also thrilled to have him with us this morning. He's a professor in the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. He's the director of Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy, which is probably the most renowned academic center for research on gun violence prevention issues. And that last part was my editorial. But his research interests include violence prevention, firearm injuries, gun policy, domestic and youth violence, and opioid abuse, which perhaps could be the topic of a whole other panel. Among other issues, Dan is a member of our own Temple Emmanuel. He's participating today, as I mentioned, from Colorado. So thanks for joining us a little bit earlier this morning. And I also appreciate his help in putting together the panel today. So that's our panel. And I think we're ready to roll here. So, so let's get going. And to start, this week we saw another school shooting. This time it was in Texas. We know that gun violence is an epidemic in the US. It's become a leading cause of death among teenagers, recently even overtaking car accidents. Also another issue that I want to touch on a little bit today in a couple of different contexts. Suicide in Maryland is the third leading cause of death among those aged 10 to 34. So this is an issue that affects all of us at many different levels. And one thing that I hadn't mentioned yet is that Fred and I have actually been friends since we were teenagers. And, this whole issue of gun violence, it's not something that was ever on our minds, not something I ever thought about, not something anyone I ever knew thought about. Yet today, according to Pew Research, a majority of US teens worry that a shooting could happen at their school. Most parents share that concern as well. It's an issue that's at the top of minds of many of our kids, many of their parents. As Fred, who's here today, can attest, gun violence can happen to anyone, and does happen to many, many, many people. So really in one generation, it's become one of the most prominent issues that faces America. It's also become an issue that divides America. The bond that ties together our panel participants this morning is that each of you are addressing this issue of gun violence prevention in different ways. There's a lot of overlap, certainly, from an activist and advocate perspective, from an academic perspective, from the political perspective, and all of these sort of interweave as well. And so I want to explore this morning, and discuss with you some of the things that you're doing, how we can move forward actually towards some real solutions to this problem, both at the national level and at the state and local level. So just a couple other quick statistics. And I want to start though with a short discussion about why the framing of gun violence and gun safety is so important as we're moving forward to try to solve some of these issues. In the US, firearm violence is the third leading cause of death. It's the second leading cause of injury-related death among kids under 18. Firearms are the leading cause of death among children and teens in Maryland. Most of those guns come from kids' own homes, right? Or the homes of friends or relatives. And one sort of bigger picture, 1 out of every 3 households contains a firearm. Fewer than half of these gun owners with a firearm in their house store their guns safely. And almost 40% of those homes have children under the age of 18, right? So there's lots of overlapping issues here. And sometimes it's hard to personalize these statistics, but that's why it's so important that people like Fred and others out there talking about their experiences. So here's my first question to the panel. Why is it so important to frame gun violence prevention as a public health issue rather than a Second Amendment issue or a privacy issue? And as we're talking about that, and I do want to do this briefly, this part of the conversation, before we get into some of the other issues. What have been some of the positive effects that you've seen from this framing, either at the national or state level? So I just want to start with Fred, and then I want to maybe go to Daniel about some of the research, and Senator Smith and Liz about like how this framing helps get traction on the legislative side in Maryland. But Fred, why don't you get started and then we'll go from there.
No, listen, thank you, Andrew. And let's start with the fact that you and I have been friends since we're teens. And I think it's important because when we were that young, you didn't think of conflicts or even community violence resulting in gun violence and deaths related to gun violence. That wasn't the thing that happened back then. And I bring it up because, you and I have known each other since just about the mid 80s. I was just part of a documentary called The Price of Freedom, which really traces the history of gun violence in this country and the growth of these, the gun lobby. And you really can trace it back, the big evolution to 1977 and a change that happened with the NRA. But this isn't our country's history. The majority of our country has been as a gun safety country. The way you said it, which is this happened in a generation, is true. And we can also fix it, but it's going to take time. You mentioned the shooting in Texas this week, which on so many levels was horrifying to me. But one of the really most horrifying parts of it is how quickly the country and the media moved on from it because nobody died. It was a mass shooting in a school. And for 2 to 3 hours, everybody was paying attention and nobody died and we moved on. That is a normalization of gun violence that we cannot allow to happen. And that really then ties to the whole public health conversation, because we are seeing the way people think of gun violence evolve. It is not, doing something about it is not a Second Amendment conversation. It has always, always, always been the big lie, okay? No legal lawful gun owner's rights are at risk. No legal lawful gun owner is gonna feel the sting of trying to reduce the risk of gun violence, trying to reduce the number of people who die because of gun violence, trying to reduce the severity of injuries that occur because of gun violence. Those are all part of a public health conversation. How do we now as a country go forward? No, we do have 400 million weapons on the streets of America, spread out in a lot of homes, unlocked. And after the Parkland shooting, okay, the Secret Service, the FBI, the former administration all did a deep dive. And I believe the number they came up with was about 73% of all guns used by kids in these school shootings and other types of shootings are from unlocked weapons in a home. Okay, so how do we communicate with the country on the need to lock up your weapons in a safe way? That's a public health conversation. And so I personally will no longer engage with people on the notion that reducing gun violence, reducing deaths related to gun violence is a Second Amendment discussion. It's not. This is a conversation now on how we save lives. That is public health. And so I appreciate you giving me the chance to express my feelings on that, and look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about safe storage as one of our issues in a few minutes, but Daniel, thoughts on sort of what is framing this in a public health way? Sort of how does that change the rhetoric, change the narrative, change how we're addressing the issue?
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a great question, and of course, sort of right in my lane, so to speak. Being based at a school of public health, I actually developed the first course in a school of public health to focus on violence as a public health issue. I think there are a few things that are particularly relevant with this frame. Traditionally, we have framed gun violence principally, or violence in general, as a crime problem. And because our society is very individualistic in our culture and orientation, and that's no accident, because we don't want to hold people in places of power accountable. But when you look at what gun violence looks like across America, a very small sliver of gun violence is committed while someone intentionally is committing a crime, say a robbery, a burglary, or something of that nature. Most acts of gun violence, fatal acts of gun violence, are suicide. This is something that is highly preventable. We've been studying this, and there are policies and programs and interventions to address it. If you look at homicide, the bulk of homicides across America are really stem from conflict, interpersonal conflict and grievances that people have, and they pick up a weapon because it's very handy, and they ruin lives, including their own, frankly. So what a public health frame does is it allows us to really expand to the nature of this problem. First and foremost, public health is a practical enterprise. It is not ideological. It is like, we have problems to solve, and we have tools to address it based upon the nature of the problem that we're studying. So when you open this up as a public health issue, yes, of course, we need to focus on some individuals and their behavior and what you can do, and sometimes you need the law enforcement system and criminal justice system as part of that. That's fine. But public health actually is all about systems. We want to change these systems, including school systems. We can and should focus on that easy access of gun to people who shouldn't have them. But in our school shootings, many of them you can see as acts of failure for the system. These are young people who have been failed by the system. I've done homicide review in Baltimore, and I'll tell you, case after case after case, you see failures of systems, school, social services, housing, and so on, drug treatment and everything. So public health frame gives you a capacity to solve the problem. And of course, we're going to focus on guns, but actually, we can focus on changing environments that we know facilitate violence. Having a lot of blight in urban areas, for example, in West Baltimore and other parts, that's a direct correlate of gun violence. And when that is addressed, very rigorous studies show shootings go down. So bottom line is, a public health frame allows you to really understand the nature of the problem, hold people accountable, including throughout these systems, right? And create changes that extend beyond the criminal justice realm. So I think that's the importance of this public health frame.
Yeah, thanks. And what about Senator Smith, politically? I mean, do you see how does this framing make a difference in terms of on the legislative side, if at all?
Sure. Well, first, I'd say good morning, everyone. And Andrew, thank you for hosting and facilitating this. And Liz, good to see you. Daniel, good to see you. Fred, thank you so much for your work. And Hannah, looking forward to working with you next session. I think look, Daniel's absolutely right. In terms of framing it as a public health issue, that gives us the policy space to make, I think, long-term and good decisions, because a lot of the knee-jerk reactions in terms of a policy perspective don't bear immediate political fruit. And you'll see that, I think, on hyperspeed in an election year, this next coming session. And it also gives you the space to get away from that Second Amendment myth, as Fred alluded to. That comes up all the time with safe storage. It's going to come up with ghost guns. And so it gives you the space to have an actually refined conversation, develop some really thoughtful policy solutions that are largely outside of the realm of the criminal justice system. Again, a lot of what we'll be focused in on, and we've got a couple of lines of effort that we'll talk about later on in the panel, but a lot of what we're going to be focused on are violence interruption programs and things that we can use outside of kind of the statutory framework of penalties and the criminal justice system. And so that's, I think, an important part of the narrative that gets lost when you don't frame something like gun violence as a public health issue. And Fred, you talked about it again. The evolution, or I should say the devolution of the NRA. I mean, that started off as a gun safety organization. Civil War veterans got together and wanted to make sure that recreational and safe use of firearms, and that is no longer within that organization's DNA. And so it's a completely different part of the political discourse that has been, I think, regressive and not helpful. And you see it every year, even in Annapolis. So even in Blue, Maryland. And so I think framing that as a public health issue, again, just going back to where I started, gives us the policy space to make the best decisions. And
Liz, for you, sort of, on the advocacy side, how does that help in terms of issues that you're advocating for, in terms of that kind of framing?
Right. So when I think about, gun violence, I always look to where are the communities that are most impacted? And my fellow panelists have already sort of spoken to this with suicide and urban gun violence. And with suicides, we're mainly talking about rural, largely white, older men. Urban gun violence, our neighbors, largely in Prince George's County, Baltimore City. And I always think about what are the things that tie those communities together. And I think there are elements of hopelessness and trauma. And I think we need to speak to how we can address that in both of these communities. We do a better job with suicides here in Maryland than we do with the urban gun violence issue. There have been a number of pieces of legislation that we've worked on to continue that work with suicide prevention here in Maryland, the extreme risk protective orders. Those are extremely important. That was passed in 2018. I can't tell you prior to that how many calls I would get from frantic family members who had a father-in-law in Western Maryland who had a gun, and they knew that he was at risk of hurting himself, and they didn't know how to get that gun out of the home. And I had to say to them prior to 2018, you can't, there's not a way, but now there is. You can petition a judge. You can go before a judge and have that gun temporarily removed. This is also sometimes referred to as the red flag law. That's really important in suicide prevention. And we also have things, and Daniel can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, but, our permit to purchase is really important when we talk about tying a gun to an individual. Background checks alone aren't going to do it. We need to make sure that that gun is tied to someone, that you have a fingerprint, you have a licensing mechanism, you have some way to make sure that that person is not going to divert that gun into the underground market. That's going to help both with suicide prevention, and it's going to help with the homicide prevention. Those are really effective ways to start working on this. Now, the violence prevention in Baltimore, the community violence, that's a big issue. And it's something that I run a coalition here in Maryland with the Community Justice Action Fund, which is an organization that works to deal with the intersection of criminal justice and gun violence prevention. I think there's a lot of important work that we need to be doing in making sure that we have better funding about what we call violence intervention and prevention programs. I won't go into great detail because there are a lot of different violence intervention and prevention programs, but just a sort of quick thumbnail sketch. These are programs where people who are known and trusted within communities go into the communities. They help stop violence before it escalates, much like a doctor would stop a disease before it becomes something that can't be cured, right? So those are important programs, important ways to invest our time and resources. And I also just want to, again, pinpoint this child access prevention. I think, Andrew, you'll give me time to talk about that more later. Should I hold that one for a little bit?
Yeah, I'm gonna get there in pretty much next. So
Okay,
yeah.
great. So we'll hold
Um,
that, but
Yeah, why don't you hold that? And I promise I'm gonna get to Hannah, but for the sake of just the time and wanting to get through some issues, I do want to move forward and talk about one of the issues that has come up in a couple of different contexts regarding safe storage of firearms. And, per the statistics I referenced earlier, there's millions of homes in the US with teens, that have with teens and younger kids, let's say, that have guns which aren't stored safely. And, to Liz's point, it's not just about teens and younger kids. It's sort of mental health issues or, older folks that, there's concern about people hurting themselves. And, this is an issue that we've started to see progress on at the state level. It's been getting some traction nationally as well. One example, in the state of Connecticut, a law called Ethan's Law was signed in 2019. That was named for a boy named Ethan Song, who was a teenager killed with an unlocked gun at a friend's house. It's the law that essentially requires safe storage of firearms in homes where children under 18 are present. Closer to home in Maryland, for us here, the bill that's been proposed is Jalen's Law, named after 16-year-old Jalen Rose Wiley, who was killed in a shooting at Great Mills High School in St. Mary's County in the same year as the Parkland shooting. And he was killed by a fellow student who brought his father's gun to school. So here's a case where we had a school shooting enabled by a teenager having access to an unsecured firearm in the home. And, in the last Maryland Assembly session, this was a bill that was sponsored by Senator Smith that would basically strengthen gun owners' responsibility and accountability for safe storage of firearms, as well as a few other things. And so, as having just had this discussion about framing gun safety prevention as a public health issue, here's an issue that's starting to have some success in doing that. When framed as a child safety issue, like car seats, seatbelts, smoke detectors, it gets traction that way. I do have questions for each of the panelists on this one. I want to, though, start with Senator Smith. So we're moving toward the 2021 Assembly session. Is this still something that you're advocating, Jalen's Law? Is it something that can get passed? I mean, to me as an outsider, I look at this and it looks like it's low-hanging fruit, and I just wonder, what's the hang up? What's going on with this one?
No, I think so. Yeah, the short answer is yes. And the background there, just for context, it was a difficult hearing. It was in the midst of a we're going through police reform, and so that was kind of the topic du jour that was sapping up most of the attention. So in the Judicial Proceedings Committee, in the Senate you have 4 committees and half the committee members, as you do for in the House. You have 6 committees, and so we're 23 members of each committee. And so our workload, we've got 25% more of the workload and half the staff, so to speak. Anyway, we had police reform, we had parole and post-conviction reform, and some immigration that kind of sapped the air. And so we just didn't have the bandwidth to get to a lot of the issues that are critically important and just it mattered to all of us. We just didn't have the time to do it. So this year, gun safety, ghost guns, and the safe storage will be of top of mind and top of the agenda for us going into the next session. It's a difficult hearing, and I think that difficulty lay in the opposition trying to confuse the court's decision in Heller with the posture of the bill. And in terms of the operability of a firearm, I don't want to get into like the line by line, but essentially those issues got confused or purposely confused. And I think that those were the arguments that made it for a more difficult hearing, and frankly would have made it for an extremely difficult floor fight. And so just with the bandwidth and the time, we just didn't have it. And we have a 90-day session every year. We only meet for 90 days. And so next year it'll be top of mind. It'll be something that'll be we'll have early hearings, and we'll have adequate time and ample time to deal with it.
No, thank you for that. Liz, where are the differences for Jalen's law vis-a-vis some of the other Ethan's law and some of the others at other states that are being passed. And, sort of what's your sort of thoughts on this one? I know that the suicide piece is also part of it. And so maybe you can talk about that, and the other thing that I think is really interesting, I don't know if that's unique to Maryland, is the safe storage map and how that's helped address the issue as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to Senator Smith for his leadership on this. We're looking forward to returning the session with this. And we have reworked this bill a good bit since last year. Just a couple of quick things. We know that 82% of youth suicides, those 82% of those circumstances, those guns are coming from the home. So they're coming from family members that aren't securely locking. That 40% of youth suicides, guns are involved. And one of the things I always say, whether or not it's youth suicide or suicide in general, people are always like, oh, suicide, they'll find another way. Well, what we see is that that's not really true. People, and I'll say too, that I come from this, I actually did never expect it to be at the helm of a gun violence prevention organization for a long time. I was a psychotherapist in private practice in New York City. So I come from a perspective where suicide was a really important part of my work. And what we know is when people attempt suicide and they're not successful, they usually get the intervention and help they need so they don't go on to attempt again. But when people attempt suicide with a gun, over 80% of the time they're successful. And so there isn't that second chance, right? So what's important about this bill, and we have an existing child access prevention bill in Maryland, but it's really weak. What this bill does that our current bill doesn't do is it adds an education component. So the Maryland Department of Health will be educating families on why this is important and how to securely lock your guns, which may sound simple to some of you out there, but this bill will also put into language the importance of storing ammunition separate from the gun itself. It will add graduated levels of penalties. So there's prosecutorial discretion when it comes to those times where people don't do it. And we're moving forward with the National Association of Social Workers on board now, helping to push this. And that I think is important that, again, this is a public health issue where there's an education component to this. There's a need for families to understand the significance that, we're not saying that you shouldn't have a gun in your home. If you want to have a gun in your home, okay, but please make sure that gun is stored separately. And another important component of this too is that right now, the law only catches 15 and under. So we're increasing this so that it's all children 18. And also we have currently on our website a map so that, say you're a grandparent, you have kids coming to the grandkids coming to visit, you have a gun in your house, you're not comfortable having that gun in your home when your grandchildren come, you can go on our website, mdpgv.org. We're partnering with Johns Hopkins and on a mapping project. You can go on, you can find law enforcement agencies, gun stores. This is a really great way to partner with gun stores, guys. They're not always enemies. This is important. They will offer storage for those weapons. And Kaskar Farsi from Hopkins has been a great leader on this. I just want to call out her leadership in running this project and how important that is.
Yeah, no, thank you for all that, Liz. I appreciate it. It's a good segue to Daniel, because I know that your team has been working on this issue on a number of fronts. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that. What's the research that you're working on showing? Where's it pointing us to?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. Actually, some of my earliest research focused on safe storage issues, both from a behavioral standpoint and from a policy standpoint. Our studies have found that safe storage laws do indeed save lives. And the most common form of death and thing that's most effective in reducing is teen suicide. Mostly, or very commonly, when we think of safe storage, we think of the very young child getting access to a gun. And of course, they don't understand what might happen and the consequences. And of course, we need to prevent those tragedies, heartbreaking tragedies. But far, far more common is a troubled teen who accessed the gun to hurt themselves or to bring it into a school to create mass death. So our findings show very protective, strong effects in reducing teen suicide. And I'm glad Liz mentioned the work on the gun storage maps that we're doing at our center, and I put a link to that in the chat as well. And I hope people will take note of that. Suicides are preventable. My mother attempted suicide many years ago. Thankfully, she didn't have a firearm. She lived another 28 years of mostly happy life, and I'm fairly certain had there been a ready access to a firearm, we wouldn't have had my mother for those years.
Yeah, no, thank you, Daniel. Hannah, so here's my question for you. This is an issue that we're talking about, that affects a lot of kids and youth. And I just wonder, from your perspective, is this an issue that can get traction from the youth perspective? I mean, I know that you guys are working on a lot of different issues, and a big part of that is the get out the vote piece of it. But what would it take for for the youth and for groups that you're working with to sort of take this issue on? Because it seems like such a no-brainer.
Sure. So I don't know how many of you, when you were in school, had to go through school shooter drills, but we have to do it maybe 4 times a semester, 8 times a year. And that is extremely traumatizing, especially because so many of the time, a lot of the time they don't tell you that it's a drill. So you're just sitting there in your classroom, just completely blind and deaf as to what's going on. And sometimes they play gun sounds in the hall, gunshots in the hallway. That's not fun. And so that's extremely traumatizing for a lot of students. And I think what can help reduce the effect of gun violence, there it is just mobilizing students and young people, because so many of us have been affected by gun violence and affected by these school shooter drills. And one way that we can really help is just registering to vote is just plain down flat. And also just calling state, local, federal representatives and saying, hey, this is an issue that I really care about. And if you say that, then their representatives are more likely to pay more attention and to put more effort towards it. And so I think that's something that can really, really affect how gun violence is looked at in America and for students. That's something students can do that's super, super easy. So
yeah, thank you, Hannah, for that. Daniel, I wanted to let you make a point that you made to us in the chat, and then I want to go to Fred for a minute to give us sort of the more national perspective on this issue.
Sure, very briefly, I forgot to mention that this isn't a study that our center has done, but there have been some studies, most recently by RAND, that show state laws that require safe storage of firearms in the home are associated with reductions in firearm homicides. Many guns that end up being used in violent acts of gun violence are stolen firearms, and safe storage, particularly if they're in locked, safe or something of that nature, does reduce gun theft, and many of those guns directly go into the most dangerous context.
Thank you. Fred, I know you're close with the Song family in Connecticut. Talk about where we are nationally on this issue. Is this one that needs to be addressed state by state? Can we get traction at the federal level on this? How do we move the needle in some of the more red states, if possible, right? Where the issue tends to be framed more as a Second Amendment privacy issue than as a public health issue.
No, listen, I love the Song family. They are another family that I have come to know, and I hate that I know. And I also know there'll be another one today and tomorrow, because that is the reality of doing nothing. And it really gets to your very first question about public health and the amazing work being done by people like Daniel and Liz, who are able to study what doing something means. It's not just a theoretical thing anymore. I look at what my friends at Northwell Health are doing, where they are engaging in the emergency rooms and in the hospital now to ask the questions about guns in the home. This is not rocket science solving this. And yet we know the next one is going to happen because we just haven't. And we have the data to say this will work. We have the data to do more for people like Hannah, who, you know, Hannah, when you were talking about your experience, it almost broke my heart, because I remember when my son went back to the school after the shooting and they went through the drills. And I realized we have kids in schools going through these drills who have already been impacted by gun violence. It's so traumatizing. When we talk about public health, what are we doing for these kids to ensure their mental health because of what we're doing? The coverage of the shooting in Texas this week talked about how prepared everybody was. And my first thought was, we are preparing our children to expect to be shot. You know, these are not normal times, and we know what we need to do. What do I think the prospect is? Listen, we need safe storage laws, and we need them. The states that are stepping up now and doing it are seeing reductions in gun violence in those states. As we all know, we're only as close as our safest border, which is why we need a national solution on this stuff. We really, really do. But it's not just about safe storage laws, because as Daniel mentioned, you know, we do know guns get stolen, and sometimes stolen by kids who then walk into a store. And even though they shouldn't be in possession of a weapon, even though they may be a prohibited purchaser, buy the bullets. And the reason they do that is because there's no requirement for a background check on bullets. You know, and so if we want to reduce gun violence, we need to also focus on the ammunition side of this. I think, Andrew, as you know, I mean, there's a law that's sitting in the House and the Senate right now called Jamie's Law, named after my daughter, which would extend background checks to bullets. There are so many things we can do to save lives. That should be the focus of all of us, the legislators, the kids, the researchers, because if we don't, we know the next one is going to happen. I'll just close with this. This week, I was part of a conversation with some of the top business executives in the country. It was with the gun safety group Brady, and we're really working with the business community to be the counterweight to some extent to the gun lobby and to legislators that have failed us. And what we did talk to them about is the legal concept of foreseeability. It's foreseeable that these things are going to happen. The workplace is, the home is the new workplace, right? 2 months ago, I think you all are aware of the story of a lady in her home having a Zoom conversation like this with her work colleagues, and her 2-year-old daughter got a hold of an unlocked gun, and on this Zoom conversation with work colleagues, shot her mom. Okay. The home is the new workplace. We need the business community to be the educators, to help us change the culture, to help us move the generational change that is needed now to save lives. And so, and it's not to let the legislators, like my friend Will Smith here, off the hook. They need to do this. But this is an all hands on deck. Gun violence is increasing. We can do something about it, and we have to start now.
Yeah, no, thank you. Again, I know there's a lot of issues we could be talking about this morning. We have a limited amount of time. I do want to make sure we get to the issue of ghost guns, which have been also talked about. by some of the panelists already. We've had some questions come in about that as well. And so maybe let's start with Daniel, just talk about what ghost guns are, why they're dangerous. Then I want to, bring in everybody else, Fred, to talk about what he's been advocating for at the national level, Senator Smith and Liz to talk about this at the state level, but let's spend a few minutes on this one.
Sure. The term ghost guns is sort of shorthand for what in formal legislation is termed privately made firearms. Privately made firearms, of course, don't go through any background check system. They don't go through any record keeping system. There are no serial numbers to allow detectives investigating shootings to find out the origins of that gun, who purchased this gun, when and where. And it has become a really growing problem in many places in the United States, mostly, frankly, the ones with stronger gun laws, because they are cheap, they are reduce risk for everyone involved in the whole supply chain to that end user. So it's an incredibly important problem that, any gun law that I might talk about, Fred or Liz or Senator Smith, they more or less go out the window if you don't address ghost guns or privately made firearms and have proper regulatory systems, because this is only going to get worse if we do not act, and we don't act in a very robust manner. People are dying with these privately made firearms. Domestic terrorists are arming themselves with privately made firearms. Very young people in Baltimore are arming themselves with privately made firearms. So this is a really critical issue. Their actions the Biden administration is looking at now with new rulemaking that I think will be important. But let me tell you, it's rarely enough to just do something at the Fred. I agree with Fred's point about we need national solutions, but when you come to the practicality and enforcement mechanisms, what we typically find is you really need both. You need both federal and state actions, and you need local officials committed to enforcing those. So we have a lot of work to get done on this issue.
Yeah, no, thank you. In fact, that's, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this particular issue is because, there, I think, is a national component, and there's definitely things that we can be doing at the state level, perhaps even more so than we can get done nationally. But Fred, just take a minute or two and talk about your involvement with this issue, how it's evolved, and sort of where you think we can go with this one.
Well, and I agree with Daniel. And in fact, one of my heroes and someone I'm thankful that I get to call my friend is Attorney General Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, who has tackled on a local level the issue of ghost guns. He's really driven the national conversation to some extent on this, because in Pennsylvania, what they were seeing is in crimes, ghost guns are a continuingly and scarily increasing number of the guns that are being used in crimes. When you look at a place like California that has really done a wonderful job with gun safety legislation, the proportion of guns being used in crimes, they're ghost guns. Another person who I hate that I know, but that I do, is Brian Mullenberger. And Liz and Daniel, you may recognize the name. His daughter, Gracie, 14 years old, was shot and killed in the Saugus High School shooting. I tell you this because that was with the ghost gun. And Brian, to show how dangerous the environment is right now with ghost guns, did something very unique. He went online and used the name of his now deceased 14-year-old daughter, and he ordered all of the components to make a ghost gun, and they were delivered to his home, and he put together a ghost gun that was ordered in the name of the 14-year-old now deceased Gracie Mullenberger. Okay, if Brian just in one simple step didn't show us how dangerous the environment is right now, I don't know what else can. And solving it will require national as well as local legislation and enforcement. This is something we all should be paying attention to. Back in 2018, I addressed the Democratic House Caucus. And I basically told them all, and Speaker Pelosi and all the others were there, that I thought they were failing the country because they were so focused on other things that they were missing things that were going to put us all at greater risk. And this is back in 18. I told you have the chance to do something about this now. And I specifically mentioned the issue of ghost guns and 3D printed home weapons. None of them knew anything about it. And I'm so glad you mentioned, Daniel, the militia groups and the other groups that are now using this technology to arm themselves. And we better be paying attention, because unfortunately, we're going to be hearing more about it in more violent instances if we don't do it now.
Yeah. Liz, what about, in Maryland, what are you working on this issue, and how does it differ in Maryland than what we might be able to get done at the national level?
Yeah. So first of all, there are a few numbers I want to share with you all. The Baltimore Police Department in 2019, of the crime guns seized in Baltimore, 29 of those in 2019 were ghost guns. In 2020, that number was 126. Between January and mid-May of this year, that number has already reached 83, and the BPD expects that number to reach anywhere between 250 and 300. Right? Talk about an increase, like that's an astounding increase. This is a really big problem, and it's not only a big problem, it's a growing problem, which is even more concerning. Daniel and Fred both mentioned what the ATF, the regulations there, those are great. It's really exciting, but it will not catch all of the guns that were sold prior to ATF regulations going into effect. So there's going to be a huge number of pieces, parts, already assembled guns in Maryland that will not fall under when and if those, and I think they will go into effect, but when those ATF federal regulations go into place, they won't fall under that. So our Attorney General here in Maryland, Attorney General Frosch, is also leading the charge here on ghost guns, and we will be coming back. We've been in Annapolis for the last few years with ghost gun legislation. The legislation is going to change significantly because of the ATF regulations, and I think we're really going to be looking and working on making sure there's a way to trace, because as Daniel said, essentially what these guns allow you to do is circumvent existing rules. It allows people to circumvent all of the rules that folks have worked so hard to pass here. And I want to say, Andrew, you mentioned that I'm the daughter of a hunter. I'm the daughter of a really avid hunter who named me after his college mentor and professor, and named my sister after his gunsmith. My dad's a hobbyist who builds guns. This wouldn't impact him because he's not going to have a problem serializing a gun, because he wants to make sure that his grandchildren remain safe, right? We're not going after the hobbyist here. We're not trying to hurt them. We want to make sure that the guns just have to follow the rules that any other gun has to follow, and that this gun isn't allowed to circumvent some rule that's been shown to be by Hopkins and numerous other organizations really safe. So that's our goal here, is just to keep people safe and protect people.
So Senator Smith, talk to me about where this one is on the priority list for this upcoming assembly, and can a state like Maryland actually go further than what's possible with ATF and the federal prosecutors and at the national level? And is this something, what would it take to get this bill passed?
Well, I think yes and yes. And just to give some context for how the legislature will view this issue. So we usually invoke a three-part test for legislation. So is there a problem that this legislation will fix? Does it actually fix the problem? And what are the unintended consequences? So that if you can pass those three small criteria, then you can get, that's it, the price for entry As Daniel mentioned, so ghost guns is kind of more precisely, it's unserialized firearms, and that allows you to circumvent and trace. It allows you to circumvent background checks, but also it prevents us from tracing the origin of where that firearm has been. And as the technology has become more democratized, more people have access to the 80%, the polymer 80 kits, or 3D printing, and these things have proliferated in Maryland. And Liz gave you some good numbers. Look, I'll give you a couple more. Michael Harrison, the police chief in Baltimore City, he said that of the ghost guns, so it's been a 300% increase over the last year in Baltimore City, but 23% of those are people were in possession of those were under 21, under the age of 21. This is a big deal. So as those 80% kits and as the 3D printing has become more democratized, this has become a growing issue and problem. Another number, from 2016 to 2019, 12,000 build kits have been shipped to Maryland, with sales exceeding over $100,000. So even on the legal market and in the black market, we've seen a massive proliferation in Maryland. And so that's number one. Number two, our Attorney General, working with Liz and Daniel, as well as Delegate Lopez and Senator Susan Lee, have been working this past summer to really refine the legislation to make sure that we have something that's ready to go and that will actually make an impact once passed. So yes, it's a primary interest of our committee, and it's a top priority for the Senate President and for the Senate. And I look forward to obviously tackling this issue. And as the ATF, you're right, I think the notice and comment period just ended. So the ATF looks like they're going to go ahead and implement those new rules changes. But again, as you know, as Liz mentioned, that won't affect everything that's in the stream of commerce already. And also, whenever the next president comes around, that's going to be subject to change because it's just a rules change. So it's incumbent upon us to make to codify a solution at the state level. And I look forward to working with everyone on the panel to do that next session.
Yeah, thanks. And Hannah, I get the feeling that, sort of my generation and sort of us, the rest of us on the panel, we're doing what we can. But I just have the feeling that it's your generation that's going to kind of lead us out of this. And I wonder, is this an issue that's on your radar? Is this something that you're talking about with your friends, your folks, in your groups that, is this an issue that you guys are thinking about? And if not, is this an issue that you guys can get behind?
So I'm going to be honest, I had to look up what ghost guns were last night. So for me, no, I'm not super aware of what it was. And I'm sure that most of my friends and most of my peers aren't super aware. But also, oh my gosh, I forgot what I was going to say.
No, no worries. You're doing great.
Thank you. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. I'm so sorry. My apologies.
No, it's okay. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I do have, I want to open this up to questions, but I do have one sort of final question for everyone. And, I wish we had more time. We could, certainly talk about lots of things and lots of issues that are, sort of that we're all thinking about and dealing with. But I want to ask each of you, and I'll just sort of do a round robin, from your perspective, what's the one most important issue related to gun violence prevention, either that we've talked about or preferably that we haven't talked about, that you're currently working on, that you feel like we can move the needle on addressing some of these issues and make progress? And I really, think about, like, in terms of making progress and moving things forward, and like, what's the issue that you're working on that can do that? So why don't I start, I guess, with Fred, and I'll just go around my screen.
I'm going to start with the issue that has become a passion for me. And listening to this conversation around ghost guns only reaffirms the importance of it. And it's to focus this conversation more deeply on ammunition. With 400 million weapons on the streets already, and with ghost guns now being just a real factor in our society, none of them work without the bullets. And so if we can extend things like background checks and make it harder for those who are in possession of ghost guns or other forms of weapons illegally, who are prohibited purchasers from having the ability to buy the ammunition to make those guns work, I think that will save lives immediately. And so that's, for me, a personal focus. I would also say this, and we didn't talk about it today. I am a huge believer in the idea that if we repeal PLCA, it changes everything.
Can you talk about PLCA a little bit? And so for those,
yeah, it's a federal law, and I'm going to make it really simple by saying it like this. It is a federal law that shields the gun industry from liability. It makes it so people like me cannot sue the gun lobby for saying you are responsible for what happened here. And I do blame them. And I think if we repeal PLCA, we do to the gun industry what happened to tobacco many years ago, because now I would have the ability to call executives of these companies and put them under oath and say, if you said your weapon was for hunting and sport, but you were building them in quantities far beyond the requirements of that business model, what did you do to ensure that they wouldn't be used in schools, on streets, and other deadly avenues? I want the ability to do that. Because I can't file a lawsuit, I've actually filed with Brady in Everytown what would have been my lawsuit as a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, because we can show that Smith & Wesson, who made the weapon that was used to kill my daughter, was marketing to teenagers. Now, that's, if we should all have a problem with that. So for me, those are, personal goals of mine that I think are tremendously important. I think all the work that is being done across this country on so many avenues to reduce gun violence matters. But for me, if I can deal with liability and I can deal with ammunition, that would be tremendous. So thank you.
no, thank you, Fred, and for all the work that you're doing on this. Daniel, what is it for you? Like, what's the big issue, whether it's something we've talked about or not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm glad, Fred, that you raised the ammunition issue, because I agree that is something that would have some immediate impact and is completely logical for us to control. I'm going to mention an area that we really haven't talked about at all, and that is sort of focusing at the local level. This past year in particular, there's been great emphasis and sort of a rethinking about how do we keep communities, cities safe. We have over-relied upon over-aggressive policing and over-incarceration, and underinvested in prevention programs and other resources. So what much of my work these days is focused on is really how do you make those systems work better so that they're effective, both the law enforcement systems. We don't talk about enforcement of gun laws enough, and illegal possession is the most proximate thing to the actual act of gun violence. But we cannot do what so many places have done in the past and do very broad, racially biased, stop and frisk kind of policing. That doesn't mean we don't do any proactive gun law enforcement. And so our center and some work that we're focusing on right now is basically trying to create a set of recommendations and a roadmap for much more narrowly focused, constitutionally and community supportive ways to enforce our gun laws, so that they're actually focusing on the individuals who are doing the shooting, while at the same time really investing and building up the infrastructure for these community interventions to be successful. There have been some studies showing some success of some programs, But going from a successful demonstration project in a particular neighborhood and then getting to it, like we're literally going to change what public safety means in the systems in places like Baltimore, for example, that is a huge undertaking. And so much of my time and energies is focused on that challenging but very exciting space.
Thanks, Daniel. Liz, what is it for you? Is there a primary thing, or is there, like, if there's one thing, what is it?
Oh, this is like choosing your favorite child. It depends on the day. That's impossible. And I feel my legislative director who's watching this might get upset because I should say our legislative priorities, which are definitely important. But for me, what drives my passion in this movement right now is speaking a little bit to what Daniel was talking about. I think that traditionally the gun violence prevention movement has relied very heavily on these criminal responses to gun violence prevention. And that's hurt a lot of communities. It's hurt a lot of Black and brown communities. And again, I want to say law enforcement is a key partner in this work. I'm not saying law enforcement doesn't. We need our state's attorneys holding folks responsible for the laws that my organization and other organizations have created. That's key. We need that partnership. We need the Baltimore City Police Department having the resources to do their work. That's key. But we also need communities that are disproportionately impacted by this violence to have the resources to be able to heal those communities. And I mentioned earlier that I run this coalition with the Community Justice Action Fund. We have struggled to get funding for these programs. In 2018, we passed a piece of legislation that funded an obscenely small amount of money. And we're talking about several $millions. And Governor Hogan vetoed it. And well, first he didn't fund it. Then we rewrote the bill so that he was forced to fund it. And then he vetoed that bill. We were able to override the veto, but these programs have been consistently underfunded, not funded. And that is a struggle. And as Daniel said, there's pretty clear evidence from communities in Oakland and New York City that these programs work. You put someone in there who knows the community, who understands what's going on, who knows the players. Again, it's a very, very small number of people in these communities who are pushing the violence. If you can work with that small number of people to help them, access to education, access to employment, access to mental health services, you can make a difference, but you have to have a structure, leadership that's willing to fund the work and willing to help make sure that we have the resources there to do the work. So that's where my passion is at this moment. But I know, tomorrow it could be different. There's so much that needs to be done in this movement, so much. And I really don't think you can pick a wrong answer.
I understand, of course, and there are no wrong answers, but thank you for that perspective, Hannah. So I never like to say that one person represents like a whole population of people, but you're the voice of the young folks here today. And so for you, what's the one issue here that gets you excited, that you feel like we can make a difference, especially coming from you and your colleagues?
Right. So for me personally, GoTV, which is Get Out the Vote, has been very important. It's been a very major thing in my life for the past like 2.5 years. And like that's extremely important, especially within this movement, because if you don't like elect legislatures that don't agree with you, then you literally can't go anywhere because there's like no one to agree with you who are making the laws. But also that where there's a lot of like the kids will save us rhetoric. I've seen a lot of uptick in that. And that's not necessarily good because we're kids. Like we can't hold the world up on our shoulders. We're not Atlas. Like we have all these things that we need to focus on, including not getting shot in schools, including just finals, and just to hold the whole gun violence prevention world up on our shoulders as teens and as kids. That's not fair. So we need other people, other older people, other smarter people to step up and help us and not just us. You know what I mean?
No, that's a really good point. And I think that is a great point. And I think from our perspective, sort of looking at you and your colleagues, I mean, it's more about, like a lot of the issues that we're talking about are so affecting you and your peers that, we just think it's important for you to also have your voice, which you do, and are sharing extremely well. So thank you.
Andrew, Hannah, I want to reach out and give you a hug. Seriously, I do. We are older than you. We are not smarter. You've got this, but we shouldn't have put you in this position. And I know every other adult here is determined to do this now for you so that you do grow up in a society where this is less of a concern. But you nailed it, okay? The number one thing we all need to do, and the reason why we are where we are today, is because not enough of us have voted, and we need to show up and vote. So I'm older than you. I'm not smarter, and thank you.
So no, thank you all. And Senator Smith, so just I'll give you the last word here before we go to questions from the audience. But what, from your perspective on the legislator side, what's the key issue, and where do you think that we can get the most traction and get something done?
Sure, we do a two-part answer on that, but I want to say for Hannah and Fred, I couldn't agree with you more, Fred, with what you said about Hannah. And one of the things that I think about with the March for Our Lives movement is that look, this debate is largely urban, suburban, and then aligns with class as well. And some of the times that the more high-profile incidents of gun violence get elevated to national and international attention, and there's a surge in movement and political activism. And there's a chapter that's unread, which is the part of the folks that don't have access to resources. And the March for Our Lives folks, those students came and said, don't forget that segment of our society that is dealing with this every single day. And I thought that was a really inclusive and important message to send. And that's something that I've been struggling with, particularly this past session, after we came off of this kind of massive police reform issue. And you want to address gun violence in both communities, in all communities. But the narrative and the dialogue is different. And I think what Daniel said and what Liz said about the comprehensive solutions, not just focusing on the criminal justice system. For me, I would like that more of this to be the conversation to take place outside of the confines of judicial proceedings, because we kind of get to the things afterwards. It's the ex post. It's after something's happened. What are the penalties? It's never the proactive reaching out, interruption, investment in communities, education, transportation, housing. It's a very comprehensive conversation you've got to have that is imprecise and doesn't bear immediate political fruit when you're in the midst of a crisis, so to speak. And so there's a more global thinking that I wish lawmakers would have, instead of just the next election cycle, whether it's 2, 4, or 6 years, just thinking long term, because I think you can make some more sound decisions that build those building blocks that will ultimately make us more safe. But more precisely, look, the two things that are top of mind for me are the ghost guns and the safe storage for next session. Those are the things that we can focus in on as legislative solutions next session, while also working for those more comprehensive things. But I think that dialogue has got to change. And Hannah, I appreciate what you said, because the GOTV efforts and the efforts of the youth saying, look, make sure you make this a comprehensive and inclusive solution and conversation. Don't forget kind of the other, so to speak. So I really appreciate the leadership from the youth.
No, and thank you all so much. We do have a few minutes to take some questions, and just I want to say thanks so much for the discussion this morning, and it gives me hope, and hopefully others as well that are tuning in today. I had enlisted a question and answer curator for this morning, but it turns out we didn't make her a panelist. So she's not seeing any questions, so we're seeing them, and I'll try to curate them as best as I can. So if you do have questions, please put them in the question and answer box, and I'll try to get through as much as I can here. Some of these issues we've sort of covered, and so I'll just sort of start with Senator Smith to segue a little bit of what you were talking about just a minute ago in terms of your legislative priorities being safe storage and ghost guns, which we've talked about. There's a question here, will there be a bill to increase funding for gun violence interruption programs in Maryland in the next legislative session. And maybe that's something Liz could speak to as well. I don't know.
So one of the key things we did last session, which was tied to the the Juvenile Justice Restoration Council, they had a set of recommendations that were coming through, and we couldn't get that whole package through, but we did fund, I think it was $2 million for programs like ROCA Baltimore and Safe Streets. And those are important, but it's a pittance. I mean, it's not enough. And you do see that, I mean, you can see it. I mean, you can see the immediate benefit of investing in programs like that in violence interruption. So I'm not aware of a line item budget or piece of legislation that's going to offer that, but I would certainly be fully supportive of such measure, because it's just time and again, every time we fund these programs, you see the benefit immediately. I actually had an opportunity to go and visit some of these programs and walk and spend a day with them, working hand in glove with the local law enforcement officers, the communities, people from the community, talking to other folks in the community. It was just a fantastic experience. And I think I'm actually going to take the committee for a committee site visit to ROCA Baltimore, and to make sure that everyone kind of gets a more keen understanding of the efficacy of these efforts, and so that we're ready to support when such a bill comes forward. That doesn't come from our committee; it comes in a budget committee, but we're looking forward to supporting that.
Thanks. And Liz, I don't know if this is anything that you're working on, but if you wanted to take an opportunity to mention any other sort of initiatives that you guys are working on that we might have not had a chance to talk about.
Yeah, so really quickly, this is a unique legislative session because we are losing a governor and we're going to be getting a new governor, which means that the way the veto works is very complicated. So we're being a little careful about how much legislation we're bringing, because if the governor vetoes a bill this session, we have to override that veto within the space of this session. We can't wait till next session to override it, which means we have to be a little more conservative in how much legislation we're bringing to the Maryland General Assembly. But Senator Smith, I would love to come back next session with your support and bring a funding bill for more of these programs. We would love to get more money to those programs. The one thing I will say is that there are conversations right now about, and this has recently been done in Connecticut and Illinois, and this does not necessarily have to be a legislative fix, but could be executive action, to have Medicaid as a form of reimbursement for violence intervention and prevention programs. So that's something we're exploring. But again, we're in a little bit of a bind this year with the way that the legislative session works. So that's putting a bit of a crimp in how much we're bringing.
Thanks. So I have a question to Hannah, which actually leads me to a bigger issue that we didn't really talk about, which is mental health. And that is, the specific question is, what school opportunities are available to students to talk about the traumas of unannounced gun shooter drills, which sort of leads me to the bigger question of mental health. And like, how is that for you and for you as a bigger sort of like, is this an issue that you're talking about with your peers? What sort of, how is this affecting you and sort of on the mental health side? Again, not necessarily you specifically, but, in terms of peers, and are there opportunities to talk, for students to talk about these kind of issues and these kind of traumas that, you talk about sort of 8 shooter drills a year, like, are there opportunities to talk about those things in school?
So my school is notoriously bad at like taking care of their students, because like just last week we had someone vandalize a school with like Nazi symbols and like white power and like homophobic stuff, and the most we got was 2 emails from the principal and a racism bad talk in a science or a social studies class. So very much no, there's not any like good way to like talk about our feelings or say like, hey, like this was wrong, can we maybe do it a little differently? So my school is very bad at that. I don't know about other schools in the area, but with the mental health thing, I have a lot of anxiety, and I know a lot of my friends and a lot of everyone at the school has a lot of anxiety, whether it be like about getting shot at the school, or just like climate anxiety, or general, just everything, because we live in such a bad time to be a person. So, and these school shooter drills, they don't help, especially when it's like as bad as they are. And because we live in such a technology-based age, you can like something could happen at 12 o'clock, and by 12:30 it's all over the news, and it's all over Twitter, and it's all over Instagram, and everybody knows about it. And there's such a push to be like, okay, there's 5 million issues in the world, why aren't you thinking about every single one? Why aren't you doing something about every single one? So that obviously that doesn't help, having to feel personally responsible for every little thing that's going on in the world. And the mental health just kind of tanks for everyone. So that's like, maybe we should like not do that, you know?
No, Hannah, thank you so much for that. Does anybody else want to address the mental health piece? Daniel, like, are you guys doing work in that area, or, I guess I'll give you the first shot at the mental health side of things to talk about.
Well, one thing I just want to say up front, which is after tragic mass shootings in particular, when the nation is faced with these kind of crises, there's a very common rhetoric that the lobby groups and the news organizations completely feed off of, which is one group saying, in essence, what the heck, why aren't we addressing easy access to firearms with sensible gun policies? And the people who want to protect the status quo of guns everywhere with no accountability will immediately say, no, we just need to address mental health, as if that was just so easy to do. Mental health is an enormous challenge. We have to look, we need better systems to address mental health. The biggest part of our gun violence problem that is connected to mental health is suicide. And of course, we can reduce firearm-related suicides with better mental health delivery and access and those things. But too commonly, a mental health conversation comes up to deflect us from addressing the issues that the powerful entities would rather we not talk about. And we're focused on the gun component of it now, but there are other systems holding accountable as well for their failures. So most of our attention has been on the suicide component of this, as opposed to the interpersonal acts of violence. But our school very broadly has a lot of efforts that are focused on addressing trauma, particularly in communities impacted by violence. And the research it's so compelling, but also very sad, of the very harmful impacts that last for decades for people exposed to gun violence.
Who else wants to? Fred? And Fred, any other thoughts on this?
Sorry, I was just saying absolutely to what Daniel just said.
Yeah.
I could not agree with every word of that anymore. And I remember it after the Parkland shooting, when there was that other side that all they want to do was say mental health, mental health, mental health, without actually ever really wanting to address and deal with mental health, without ever wanting to talk with the cost and complication of dealing with and addressing mental health. Listen, mental health is a huge component of gun violence, and Daniel said it. When 2/3 of the deaths related to a weapon are suicide. So we can't ignore it, but it is too often used as just a means to deflect from all of the tough challenges and the tough options to reduce gun violence. So we do need to talk about mental health. We need to have a plan for addressing mental health as it relates to reducing gun violence, but also the lasting consequences of gun violence, because you have communities of people who are affected when gun violence happens, whether it's local instances or a mass shooting. You have schools, people like what Hannah's been describing, who are affected by gun violence, whose mental health needs to be addressed. Their anxiety needs to be addressed, not blown off. Your school, the administrator should be held accountable for blowing it off. And so we do need to deal with this. We need to have the hard conversation around it. Unfortunately, for too many people, they don't want to.
And how much has,
Excuse me, Andrew, if I could just jump in briefly, Senator Smith has to leave.
oh,
And
yeah.
if I could just, Senator, just convey a couple of questions that are in the Q&As for you before you leave. From Richard, will there be a bill to increase funding for gun violence interruption programs in Maryland in the next legislative session? And I'll just read a couple more. Will there be a bill to increase funding for greater resources to prosecute violations of gun laws? And finally, what will the focus of the Maryland state legislative activities be in the upcoming legislative session regarding gun violence prevention? Thank you.
Well, for the first, I know, Liz, we spoke a little bit to the first two about the strategy for funding, given if in the last term of a session, if the governor vetoes a bill and it's not within the timeline that we have left for session before it ends, then we can't override that veto until the next term begins. So there's a little bit of strategy going on there. I'm unaware of funding mechanisms or pieces of legislation that are coming forward for funding. So I'm just unaware of that. I did mention the last year we did put $2 million, which is just a drop in the bucket for some of the violence interruption programs like ROCA and Safe Streets. But I'm unaware of those, for those first two mentions, I'm unaware of any efforts along those lines. For your third question, just the legislation that we focused in on, look, I know that you'll see some, I'm aware of a piece of legislation that deals with straw purchases. I'm aware of ghost gun legislation or unserialized firearms legislation, and obviously the safe storage. So those are the three major lines of effort that I'm aware of for, that are directly on point for firearms related offenses and firearm safety. For programs like ROCA and other comprehensive approaches, I'm not sure that you can legislate, how that activity is rolls out and actually takes place, but you can again do the funding. So we'll see how that goes, but I don't have on point on site information for the funding piece. Maybe Liz, you maybe have heard what advocacy groups are working on, but I haven't heard anything in my committee for those two.
Yeah, thanks, Senator Smith. As I spoke earlier, there's some discussions right now about Medicaid reimbursement. And again, we've got our hands tied a little bit with the way that the veto works. So we're trying to be a little cautious with how much legislation we bring about.
Yeah, makes sense.
Do folks have a couple more minutes, or should we call it? Senator Smith, you've got to run?
I can stay for a little bit longer. I can stay for a little bit longer.
We've got a couple more questions, and let's go to like maybe 5 more minutes, and then we'll call it. This has been a great discussion, and but there's one here about ghost guns, where it says, are countries that normally do not have gun violence issues, such as Britain or Japan, having problems with ghost guns? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that, but if so, or if not, in other words, if they're not having those issues, is there something we can learn from them? And that might speak to our broader issues as well, I think, in terms of lessons we could learn from some of these other countries, and if there is anything. Daniel, you want to give that one a shot?
Well, honestly, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I really don't know the answer to that question. The gun violence problems that we face in the United States are enough to keep me busy all day, every day, frankly. But it's not something that has come up. I wouldn't be surprised, though, because I think the whole market and reason for these is to evade gun regulations. And these other countries have stronger gun legislation. So I suspect that that these are a problem. And, I'll see what I can learn about that. But again, I think there are a lot of smart and committed people working on this in the U.S., in Maryland, and in other places. So I think we can, we have potential solutions. I don't want to pretend they're easy ones, but there are things that could make a huge difference.
Yeah, thank you.
And I don't have any better answer than Daniel does, but I'll add something to it. There may, even if they have the access to the ghost guns because of you can order it online, there may be less consequence because they're not flooded with ammunition the way we are. So I do think that makes the environment completely different in these other countries. And so I will just leave it there.
I just had a question about explaining what ROCA is.
Yeah. So really quick. Oh, I'm sorry. Will, do you want to? You just did the. Go ahead, Senator.
It's a violence interruption program. They folks that have been either involved in the criminal justice system or are just close to the community, basically, and have relationships with people. And so sorry, my daughter's in the background here. The police department. So in Baltimore, the police department has a list of at-risk folks and folks that they've worked with, people that have been have a high propensity to be enmeshed or involved in the criminal justice system. And these groups help target and facilitate constructive conversations and diffuse potential lines of conflict that can devolve into gun violence. And so through their network of just interpersonal relationships and their routine checkups, they're able to interrupt a lot of things that happen. And they work hand in glove with the law enforcement officer. So if the law enforcement officer actually will see something going down, they will contact a violent interrupter and they'll go out onto the scene and try to diffuse the situation before it escalates into some semblance of gun violence or any other violence. But it's a really great program. Like I said, I'm taking the committee to ROCA and Safe Streets as a site visit so that we have just a more in-depth and rich understanding of the importance of this avenue of kind of problem solving as opposed to new criminal penalties necessarily in the criminal justice system. So that's effectively it. But I can drop a link to their website if you like as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
My apologies for the disruption.
No, not at all. No, I mean, I think we're all used to kind of the work at home being on Zoom. It's all good. Look, I know we're sort of a little over time. Does anyone want a last word from folks, or Senator Smith? I'll let you run and we'll run, but you have a last word or anything else you want to share, and then I'll just go around real quick and then we'll call it. Oh, maybe you didn't hear that part.
No, that's what I did. Thank you. I just want to say thank you all for everyone here, and especially Hannah. Thank you for your advocacy and for your example. It inspires people like me who are in the legislature because you kind of have a keen understanding of who you're working for. And too often, I think people in elected office forget that we work for you. And so I just think that that's a great reminder, and your example is an inspiration. And for everyone else on the panel, I just want to say thank you for your work that you've done, and it will continue to do next session. I'll hold up my end of the bargain on my part, and I know you'll keep us all accountable in the legislature. So just thank you all for facilitating this conversation, and thank you for your work. I look forward to working with you next session.
Thank you. Fred, last word?
As we have just been on here for the past 15 minutes, I was taking a look at my phone and reading reports of a mass shooting that happened last night at a bar in Minnesota. I think about 15 people were shot, 1 is killed. I mention it because our failure only makes it completely predictable that these will keep happening, and there's a chance we will be affected by one in the future. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I'm so glad you had Hannah on here to remind us all of why this matters so much. It doesn't have to be this way. And Hannah and her classmates and their futures should look different than what we've now just gone through. We are better than this, but if we don't act, if we don't start treating this as the public health issue that it is and moving off the Second Amendment plank, things are going to be even worse. It doesn't have to be this way. So join us. Like Hannah said, vote, vote, vote. Thank you, my friend, for putting this on.
Oh, gosh, my pleasure. Thanks for being here. Hannah, give us one last piece of advice.
Register to vote. Go to vote.org. It takes 2 minutes. Go do it.
Thank you so much for being here, Hannah. And you'll see Fred soon in a little bit later this afternoon. Liz, leave us with one last thought before we go.
Well, Andrew, Diane, Larry, I want to thank you guys so much for pulling this together. I am honored to speak. Hannah, again, this is really important. Daniel, I mean, I turn to Daniel all the time for advice and support, and we'll be talking to him later this week. But I want to say, you know, I got involved in this movement because I had 2 minutes where I thought my children were at a mall shooting, and they weren't, with my husband. And those 2 minutes were the worst 2 minutes of my life, and they pale in comparison to what the Gutenberg family has gone through. And I mean, I get emotional just thinking about it. Like, I have such awe and respect for what you've done, Fred. You know, all of us who are in this movement deal with hate and people coming at us, and to be able to wake up every morning and do what you do and face those people and to honor your daughter that way and to do it for all of us. I am so grateful to you. And again, just in awe of you. And so I know that Jamie's life will have impact and have meaning because you've chosen to take this route. And I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Daniel, I think you're last to give us the last word.
Well, that's hard to follow that. These are great comments, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to participate on this. Thank you for everybody, all the efforts to put this together. I guess what I want to leave folks with is I agree with Fred's point about this horror that we are living through will not change unless we act. I also want to really underscore that there are things that are actually positive going on in gun violence prevention right now that are saving lives. And while Fred can look at his phone to see the horrible kind of thing that just happened in Minneapolis, Fred or I or Liz or Hannah, none of us can look at our phone and say, wow, a handgun licensing law just prevented a homicide in Maryland, right? So those things that don't happen aren't going to flash on your news screen in your news feed. And this is actually a point I made when Rabbi Stone gave me a few minutes at High Holy Days several years ago that I wanted people to walk away from, is that they're committed individuals in Roca and Safe Streets and other community organizations. There are law enforcement. There are people like Fred and Hannah and Liz working on this. It matters. It matters. It can seem as though nothing can change or will change, but I want you to know, based upon 30 years of research that I've done, things matter. They lead to fewer deaths and injuries and trauma. And so do not lose hope. We can make change on this.
So I just again want to say thank you to everyone. Hannah, thank you so much for being here. Liz and Daniel as well. This has been way beyond my expectations in terms of how this would go. And this is the first time we've done something like this where we've had, you know, a panel of folks talk about a particular issue like this. And so I just, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so much. Fred, my friend, thank you as well. And I know that we'll be talking soon. And I know that you'll be talking in a little bit. You can go have a quick little lunch break, and then you've got the kids to go talk to for a little while later this afternoon. So I'm going to leave it there. We will have this recording available. I'm going to send it out to the panelists. I'll get it out to the Temple. I know we have kind of a clunky website. I'm not sure the logistics of getting it posted, but we'll get it out. And if anyone wants a recording or a copy, just feel free to reach out to me or to the temple, or to Larry or Diane, and we'll get it to you. So with that, I say thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and peace. And we're going to get this. So thank you.